there's going to be, as you said, there's going to be so much more pressure now, I think, from anti-Chinese people within the Conservative Party to have a look at that and do something about it. I can see, I agree with you, I can see by the end of the year that it gets reviewed and maybe they get shut out completely, or maybe those levels get reduced quite significantly.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Here we are, week 400 of being locked down with the usual suspects. What are we going to talk about? We're in the middle of quarterly earnings season, so we're going to talk about that on several levels. I think we're going to start by talking about Nokia. Then we're going to talk a bit about China, where there's a distinct Nokia angle, but there's a bunch of other stuff going on to do with China. And then I think we'll finish off with a bit more of a rundown of other quarterlies. And I forgot to remind you where you can get hold of this, although slightly redundant as you're already watching / listening to it, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you're watching it on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Okay, so quarterly. So I'm going to start with Nokia. I've got a few things to thread together this week, so I might be a little bit distracted. But the long and short of it is Nokia's numbers were solid enough in common with their competitors. There wasn't a big drop off. I think their sales were down a tiny bit, but they would have been more or less flat or even a bit up if it wasn't for about 200 million euros that they blamed on coronavirus. I'm going to straight away hand it over to you, Ian, because you've written a couple of bits on Nokia and you've got some interesting analysis on their sort of broader strategic situation. So tell us a little bit more about Nokia's numbers and what's going on with them, mate.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, they were kind of okay, I think, overall. I mean, interesting that they kind of attributed some pain to COVID-19, which is a bit of a contrast with Ericsson, where they sort of said they hadn't really seen any impact in the first quarter. And actually, as you said, that 200 million euro figure, which they blamed, I think, mainly on supply chain constraints in the first quarter. And there was quite a big drop off in China. I think that was mainly why the sort of revenues organically were down about 3% from a top line perspective. But I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens to them in the second quarter, really, because they were warning about demand issues in the second quarter, in the sense that it might be difficult to just sort of access customer premises and things like that in countries that are still under lockdown in Europe. And obviously the lockdown came into effect in March, so you haven't actually seen that much of an effect in the first quarter from it. So I don't know. It's an encouraging quarter in a way, but I think it could be a difficult one for them in Q2 in some of the markets they're in. And the other interesting thing I took out of it was obviously China, because they didn't only see this quite big revenue decline, which you can blame on COVID-19 to some extent, but they pretty much signal that they've given up now on 5G radio in the Chinese market. And this comes after a few reports that they've missed out on these big deals that have been offered recently. China Mobile had a sort of $5.2 billion tender, and then the other two operators, Telecom and Unicom, also were reported to have handed out some contracts, and they were reported not to have landed anything there either. And they not only confirmed they didn't get anything, but they basically said they weren't going to be trying to win any 5G RAN business now in the Chinese market, which is it's a massive kind of loss, really, because that's the biggest country in the world by far as mobile infrastructure goes. I think Ericsson's CEO was saying it's about 60% of the 4G market, and he doesn't see there's any reason why it wouldn't be similarly important to 5G. So it's just a huge the repercussions are really pretty big, I think, in terms of their headline sales. I mean, I think China accounts for about 8% of revenues. How much of that comes from mobile, I don't know. And they've obviously still got a 4G presence there, but you've got to worry about that of not featuring in 5G deals. You've got to worry about what that means for the 4G business in the future. And can they offset it in other areas like IP and optical? I'm not sure, but you look at how much mobile accounts for in terms of Nokia Networks' overall business, and it's about 2/3 of sales. So it seems very unlikely they can. So, for a company that's trying to obviously be a big competitor in 5G. They're trying to put a lot more R&D into that area. They're trying to recover from some of the product problems they've had last year. I just think it's a massive setback not to be in that Chinese market anymore.
Yeah. The only thing I wonder about that, so that's completely consistent with what I derive from their quarterlies, but you also listened in on the call, which I didn't, showing that you're much more professional than I am. And where they, for them to overtly say the game's up is quite stark in these calls, because they're normally quite evasive about their language. One thing I did do was publish some slides from their presentation, and I think Greater China, which is a very nuanced term because that means things like Taiwan, which Taiwan would beg to differ about, was down something like 28% in terms of revenue, which, obviously things like not getting any of the 5G RAN deals will be a big part of that. One thing that I think is worth mentioning in the context of Nokia is they did score a big deal with Bharti Airtel in India. There's a product they call SRAN. I need to look it up. I've forgotten what the S stands for. Super duper. No.
Single RAN.
Single RAN. And the pitch is that it's all very simple and it's one size fits all, and you can cover all the bases with it and easily upgrade to 5G. So I suppose if you're going to stretch it, you could call that a 5G deal potentially in future. But that was a nice consolation for them. And one other thing, Ian, I just want to sort of propose to you, just thinking out loud. You talk about China being this massive market. 60% of the global market is China. I mean, that is just ridiculous.
That's Ericsson's CEO thinks that 60% of the 4G market is China. I mean, you're talking about a market that's millions of base stations. I think the number of 4G base stations they've now got installed in China it's a couple of million, I think, at least. It's possibly more than that. It depends how you measure a base station, because there's sort of mini kind of microcell type stuff that can be included as well. But you're certainly talking a couple of million at least, which is just substantially more than most other countries have. So it's just a huge infrastructure market, and this is why the big Chinese equipment vendors themselves, Huawei and ZTE, can always sort of rely very heavily on doing quite well just from the fact that they're in China, and they always pick up the lion's share of the business. And it's even bigger now. It's, most of the work has gone to them with these 5G contracts that have been awarded recently by all accounts.
Yeah, the thing I was going to propose, or just think out loud about, is just how much hassle it is for a non-Chinese company to do business there, and how much hassle it might increasingly become as I think we all agree, the relationship between China and sort of Europe and the West is going to become more difficult. It was heading that way anyway, and I think most people agree that process has been accelerated by the coronavirus thing. I just wonder, presumably it's fine. They can still do business. They can still make revenue and all that sort of thing. But I wonder how many hoops they have to jump through. I wonder what other disadvantages they're at. So maybe there's worse things than not having to put up with that. Does that?
Yeah, and maybe they can pick up work in other markets to compensate for it. I mean, like you said, they've got this big deal in India, which is significant. The Indian operators seem to be leaning more and more towards, well, they want to try and promote their own companies, which is quite strange because they don't really have any kind of big equipment providers on the mobile side at the moment. But there's certainly some kind of Indian government strategy to promote domestic software and hardware players. But they're kind of turning away from the Chinese, and I do wonder now, with what's going on in this sort of post-COVID-19 environment, whether some of these European markets that have not shut out Huawei and ZTE completely, they've carried on allowing those companies to operate. I just wonder now whether it becomes a lot harder for Chinese firms in some of these markets, and maybe that's a good thing for Nokia in those countries.
Yeah, well, that is going to happen. I mean, I don't think it's inconceivable that when the dust settles on all this, our government is going to have another little think about the position it took on Huawei. I don't know about you guys. this still comes up in general conversation. I've mentioned this before on the pod, but this is one of those topics that people will bang on about on social media, or if we're ever allowed in the pub again. And I'm in the rare position of knowing more than the average person on the matter. And so they talk about Huawei, and they're like, well, how can we let Huawei in when they're just going to spy on us and all that kind of shit? And I try and point out the nuance, like we're keeping them out of the core and all that sort of thing. But people are being quite black and white about it. Anyway, I generally still defend our government's position, the decision it made on Huawei. Not necessarily because of any feelings I have one way or the other on Huawei, just because, you know, we're hearing during this pandemic, listen to the experts. Well, our experts said that we can manage the risk at a certain level, and there will also be lobbying from the operators saying if you totally make us strip it all out, it's going to be a nightmare for us. And so then there's consumer considerations, there's competitiveness considerations, all that sort of thing. So it always strikes me that our government weighed up all those expert views and tried to find the best compromise position. But the strongest counter argument I get when I say that is the political one. It's like, yeah, but we've pissed off the Yanks, and you know, and what are we getting out of it? And you've got to pick a team and all that sort of thing, which I object to. But I can see that public sentiment is going away from me and towards these people who want to pick a team. So I wouldn't be surprised if politically this government feels compelled before the end of the year to at least announce a rethink of the position it adopted at the start of the year. Does that seem credible to you guys?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think it was always on the cards anyway, because I think if you look back at the original statement, there was something in there about these levels. I can't remember what the exact levels are now. It's something like 35%, isn't it, on the 5G radio access network side that they're allowed, which is measured in terms of base stations or traffic levels, and then I think something similar in terms of fiber as well, but measured on the basis of households. But I think in the original document there's something about those levels being reviewed again in the future. It's almost like they developed it with a view to, you know, like as you say, they don't want to make things too hard for operators at the moment, because, you know, if they have to go around tearing out equipment and replacing vendors, it's a costly process. It could slow down the shift to these new services. You know, the UK is already quite a long way behind some other markets when it comes to full fiber networks anyway. It's you know, it doesn't want to lose a good position that it started out with in 5G. So I think they've tried to do a sensible compromise at first, but there's going to be, you know, as you said, there's going to be so much more pressure now, I think, from anti-Chinese people within the Conservative Party to have a look at that and do something about it. I can see, I agree with you. I can see by the end of the year that it gets reviewed, and maybe they get shut out completely, or maybe those levels get reduced quite significantly.
Yeah, and if we do that, the Chinese are going to kick off big time, because they'll see it as the political move that it will be. Anyway, I'm breaking my own discipline because China was supposed to be our middle segment. Going back to Nokia, Ian, before we stop talking about Nokia specifically, another thing that I'm just reminded of looking at these charts, a positive for them was their software division. Did you sort of look into that at all, or conclude anything from the fact that their software division was quite up in terms of revenues year on year?
Well, it's not a surprise, because that part of the business has been doing quite well for a long time, and it's, you know, they're kind of regarded as a strong player in that area. The problem is it's quite small still. I think it's about 12% of overall sales, and you know, it includes a lot of things, like, you know, things like the core network on the 5G side gets included under software. So it's doing well, but it's not something they can really rely on too much, given the size it is at the moment. I mean, one thing that worries me about Nokia, I have to say, and I didn't really think about this too much until after the whole sort of you know, results announcement was out, and we'd all listened to earnings and written stories up, but they're the only one of the big kind of vendors at the moment that's got this declining R&D spend. Last 4 years, I think now their R&D spend has been going down, and they're only just profitable. I think they barely scraped a profit in the sort of net profit level yesterday for the first quarter. Operating profits, they're either loss-making or just about profitable, depending on which accounting measure you use. So they're under a lot of pressure to cut costs still, and they have this big cost-saving target of about 500 million a year they want to get rid of, which they say they're on course to meet. But that does include R&D cuts as well. And they've made a big deal about they're not cutting 5G spending. You know, that's an area where they're continuing to pump money in, and they're even increasing what they're spending there. But the implication is they're obviously cutting in other areas, and they will probably themselves say, well, most of that's legacy. It's technologies that we don't really need to support anymore. But I just wonder about some of the Nokia strengths, things like software and things like IP and optical. You know, is there a risk to the competitiveness of those units while R&D spending, while the kind of headline level is going down all the time? And it just doesn't look very good for them at the moment, when the Chinese players in particular are pumping so much more money into that area.
Yeah, agreed. The R&D thing is becoming a little bit politicized in itself, because when you get people like Alibaba and Huawei and whatever talking about investing in R&D, sometimes it's with a distinct angle of to make ourselves as autonomous as possible, brackets from the Yanks, close brackets. So that's the thing. In fact, that gives me a little segue into the China segment, and also gives me an opportunity to invite Jamie to talk about one of his pieces, which is one of our most read pieces of the week, which is that Jamie, who's currently regretting leaving his camera pointing at a doorway.
All right.
So we get to see Jamie's extended scene going on in the background. FCC, the US telecoms regulator, has basically moved. This was at the start of the week. Has moved to ban Chinese operators from any kind of presence in the US, if I remember rightly. I'm struggling a little bit because it was at the start of the week, and my addled brain doesn't go back that far. So I'm going to stop making a fool of myself and hand it over to you, Jamie. Why don't you tell us all about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something which has been going on for a while now, because there are several. No idea what's going on back there, actually. Hold on, I'll just shut the door as well. Okay.
We're so professional, it hurts.
Yeah. This has been going on for quite a while now. So it's basically you have the Chinese companies which have licenses to operate in the US. Now, China Mobile had its license questioned about 6 or 7 months ago. And effectively, the reason they need to have a license in the US is to help sort of international corporations deliver their business model in different markets. So, there are certain telcos which have licenses to operate in certain other markets, which might not be there, might not make sense, but it's to serve multinational corporations. Ultimately, the FCC have turned around and said, should we be offering Chinese companies these licenses? Now, perhaps the most interesting aspect of this review is the way that it's been worded. So, for instance, the FCC language is that they will not renew the licenses unless there's good reason presented them to do so. Now, most people, when you go into a review, you would hope that the judge starts off on a neutral ground, whereas what the FCC has done here is that they've made a decision and they've asked for companies to produce evidence to change their mind. Now, it might only sound like a nuance, but it is a very, very, very difficult thing to do in a period which is very, very anti-China. So I think that's a slight nuance, but I think it's very important. And it looks incredibly unlikely that the Chinese companies are going to have these licenses renewed. I think it's like the 214 authorization license, which allows foreign companies to operate telecommunication services in the US. I think that's the specific of it.
Yeah. Okay. So that just feels like while the specific sort of directive's quite technical and quite preliminary at this stage, it feels like another sort of piece of momentum going against them. And another one that I think I wrote about on the same day was India making a specific move to restrict foreign direct investment. And again, there's slightly circuitous language because they said they're going to restrict foreign direct investment from anyone that they have a land border with, which seemed quite arbitrary. You know, why would the investment be all right as long as there's a bit of sea in between them? And so to me, that's clearly them saying China without saying China. They're not referring to, as I said in my piece, sort of Bhutan or Nepal or something like that. They're referring to China. And this is an interesting thing. And when I finish this bit, I'll ask you to sort of recap on what we were chatting about before we started recording, Ian, about reading about this in The Economist. But basically, China's made no secret of the fact that it's got this Belt and Road Initiative, which gets its name from the old sort of Silk Road of antiquity, of trade between the Far East and Europe. But this Belt and Road Initiative, if you know, one way of interpreting it is a form of, let's say, economic imperialism. In other words, they say they just want to open up trading opportunities around the world, but they do seem quite proactive about actually buying assets around the world, sometimes even like distressed assets, so they can then effectively take over control. I seem to remember a while ago that happened to some Sri Lankan port, which is now entirely owned by China. And so what I suspect India's doing with this move is they're thinking, okay, with this coronavirus, there's going to be a lot of distressed assets out there, i.e. a lot of companies struggling, share prices down the toilet, struggling to manage debt, all that sort of thing. China's got plenty of cash, so they come in, knight in shining armor, with all their cash, but effectively start buying stuff up such that it becomes a strategic concern. So that's what I think India's doing there. And Ian, is that consistent with some of the stuff you've been reading in places like The Economist?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not just those markets either. I mean, there's stuff going on in Europe even. I think quite a lot was made of these comments that came out of the European Union when Vestager, I don't know if that's how her name's pronounced, but the commissioner anyway was sort of saying in the Financial Times interview that it would be, you know, something for national governments to think about, to take stakes in European firms, prevent them from becoming sort of subject to takeover. So there's obviously a worry. You know, China's trying to use the current situation for kind of economic and political gain. And the Economist is usually quite balanced and doesn't really jump one way or the other. It tries to steer a fairly sort of cautious line. But even they were kind of being quite critical, I think, in the latest edition about sort of they see coming from China at the moment, and they haven't really sort of done themselves any favor, I don't think, in the way that they've kind of come at this and approached it. And I mean, it's a difficult one for them, really, I suppose, you see, because anything they do that can sort of be portrayed, you know, it can be sort of painted in a certain light depending on which side you're on. It's like with Huawei there was a story about them dishing out face masks, I think, and personal protective equipment in the US, and they took a lot of flack for doing it because it was seen as a kind of soft power move, and I think they're just in a really awkward situation. I mean, even comments on the earnings call with Huawei where they were saying, you know, that they come and help European countries at the moment with 5G because it could help to spur a kind of economic recovery. I mean, if Nokia or Ericsson said that, no one would bat an eyelid, but with Huawei saying it, it comes across as, oh, well, they're sort of using this to try and grow their share of the market even more. So, and then automatically people have kind of got their, you know, their alarms ringing, and they're sort of wary about Huawei. So they're just I think Chinese companies are in a really difficult spot at the moment.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken about this lots when we've been speaking about Huawei in the past. When sort of overall trust deteriorates, that's when people will characterize moves exactly as you said. If identical moves from a company you trust and a company you don't trust will be interpreted, or a country you trust or don't trust will be interpreted completely differently. In fact, I think that's a great example of how, how the sort of polarized nature of public discussion, and the sort of confirmation bias that so many public commentators suffer from. You look at, for example, I don't know, UK politics. Like I was reading an article by Douglas Murray before we started this about Boris Johnson getting coronavirus, and then he's just had a kid, and he's talking about how certain people, actually including the European correspondent of The Economist, so he tweeted something very skeptical about the whole thing. And if this guy's a European correspondent of The Economist, the chances are he's very pro EU and thus hostile to anyone that's pro Brexit. And so that's just an off the cuff example of how people's level of trust and level of regard for a given person or event or thing or country or company will massively color how they respond to what could be quite a sort of neutral gesture, as you say, like handing out a bunch of PPE or whatever. And that's really what's gonna sort of continue to get worse for them. I suppose they've got to keep trying, but yeah, I completely agree with you on that one. One other, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, we've talked about this a long time, this sort of, we keep using this word balkanization, but I think, that you see that, just bringing it back to telecom specifically, and seeing what's going on in China with Nokia and seeing moves that European governments might make, and the story that Jamie covered, can just see the whole market coming out of this looking a lot more fractured than it has. That was going on anyway to some extent, but COVID-19 is just a sort of accelerant for all of that, I think. And, where we will be at the end of the year or this time next year, I don't know, but you even see countries now that were never really had an interest in telecom infrastructure or building their own networks suddenly saying they're going to develop their own 5G technologies. I mean, Vietnam announced this, I think, earlier in the year. There's a Latvian company doing a similar thing. You've got the Indians wanting to do it. Russia, I think, is now talking about having its own sort of network equipment vendors, and it's all becoming, the fragmentation that was already kind of happening, I think, is just going to sort of gather momentum, I think, whilst this pandemic's around.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see. I won't go down this tangent too far because it's much more of a big picture thing. But what that's going to mean for economies and cost of living, because if every country starts duplicating effort, then on one level that's going to create more domestic jobs, but on another level it will presumably drive prices up, because one of the reasons we're so heavily integrated with China is we've basically been exporting cheap labor indirectly through their cheaper products, because they can make stuff, because the amount they have to pay the average dude in China is so much less than here. We're effectively importing wage deflation. And so if we're going to start cutting them off, then we've got to pay British people British wages, which again has good and bad things. It might mean higher employment, but it will mean everything costs a little bit more. And maybe, it's you don't want to be glib about it, but maybe things are too cheap. Maybe the go on. Sorry.
It's an interesting one on the cost front, because that's one thing I've always said as well about the I mean, you see companies like Ericsson, for instance, now trying to diversify its kind of manufacturing base, and they have this facility they set up in Texas quite recently where they're making equipment for the North American market. You talk to the Open RAN guys, about them trying to bring radio manufacturing out of places like Taiwan and South Korea and have it done in North America. And I've asked these guys about costs. Isn't it just going to drive up costs a lot more anyway? And their response tends to be, I mean, they say a couple of things. One thing that, the North American market can probably bear slightly higher prices anyway, so that will mitigate it to some extent. But the other thing is automation, and a lot of these jobs now, look at this facility that Ericsson's got, apparently has about 100 employees. Now, I don't know what that you'd normally have in a facility like that, but it sounds very low. And Ecom himself was making comments earlier this year saying things like it's probably not going to grow above that. They can serve all of North America's demand with that kind of workforce because of heavy automation. And I sort of feel automation maybe is, you know, these jobs, they're not going to come back, but maybe automation is a way to have a lot of this stuff done outside China now without that kind of cost issue.
I mean, the one thing to add there, Ian, is that last year I was out in China and I got taken on a tour of the Huawei R&D facilities, and on another day I got taken on a tour of their manufacturing facility. It was me and Tien, one of the video producers over in the US. Now, we couldn't actually do any filming or take any pictures inside the manufacturing facilities, but Huawei's, I mean, these Chinese plants are already heavily automated. So, you know, you can talk about there being a cost saving because of automation. Well, my gut says that with Chinese facilities already being automated, especially the high tech ones such as component foundries or smartphone production, they can say that there's a cost saving, but what are you cost saving against if the status quo is already automation? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I mean, this is the expectation they can do that, but as you say, it's not as though automation isn't available to these, you know, to the Chinese market and other markets in Asia, and they're so far ahead anyway in terms of what they're doing because they have the setup already. So, you know, it's a claim that gets made, but yeah, I'm skeptical as you are that they will be able to do it and sort of bring costs down in the way that they think, because as you say, they've kind of taken advantage of this stuff already.
Okay, I'm going to move it on to other quarterlies. There's been a bunch of quarterlies. All the big tech giants have announced numbers, and we've also got numbers from smartphone shipments. So to combine the two, I'm going to get Jamie to start off with Apple, who he was just writing about today. How's it looking for Apple, mate?
Yeah, I mean, the quarterly figures. Oh, I just saw a glass you were drinking out of there, Ian. That's the one
Coors Brewery.
Yeah.
Happy days. Back when we were allowed to walk and roam the world freely.
I use mine to carry all my to hold all my pens and scissors. We went to the Coors Brewery when we were doing the big communication events last year out in Denver. So that was Jeff from Light Reading drove us up there. So it was good fun.
I remember it snowing heavily. It was freezing.
Yeah, it was miserable. It was so cold. Yeah, but I mean, on the financials, it's somewhat of a tricky period for the technology industry, because I don't think there's any middle ground. Looking at the big internet companies, there's either some that have been really hit hard by coronavirus, and some which have been barely dented at all. Now, looking at the ones that got hit hard, Twitter was released its financials yesterday, and it wiped out basically all of its profit, and it lost $7 million. $7 million this financial quarter. Uber and Airbnb and Booking.com, they're other internet companies which are suffering very badly, primarily because of what they do. But you look at the ones that have really sort of like managed this turbulent time very effectively, are the ones that have heavily invested in diversified business models. So for instance, your Microsoft has come out very well. 15% year-on-year revenue growth is just utterly remarkable, and it's now back to being the most valuable company on the planet. 1.35 trillion market capitalization. Or Saudi Aramco, I can't remember exactly which one between those two. Google is another one. It's heavily invested in sort of diversifying other areas, including Fitbit, which is under review from the ACCC in Australia and the DOJ in North America. So it'll be interesting to see if the wearables area is expanded for them. And then the final one is Apple. Now, Apple is, everyone thinks of Apple as an iPhone business, but it's been growing its services, software and services division, and also wearables, home entertainment, accessories, and content very, very quickly over the last couple of quarters. And you just have a look at all of these businesses that are diversified. They've managed to offset any negative impacts of COVID-19 by accelerating the production and processes in other business units. Now, Apple is a very interesting one because their smartphone still accounts for anywhere between, depending on the quarter, 49 to 60% of revenues, but it declined this year. It declined this quarter. Now, I think that COVID-19 is a massive red herring. If you actually look at the product deployment map, everything this year was geared towards the second half, where they were going to launch a 5G device. Now, all of their marketing spend, not all of their marketing spend, obviously, a large chunk of their marketing spend and R&D was going to be going towards the 5G device, which is going to launch in September, possibly October, if you believe the rumors that it's been kicked back because of supply issues. The SE that was launched about a month ago, there's nothing really special about it. There's nothing particularly different from what it did from what it launched last year with the iPhone 11. It's just cheaper, and yeah, just might as well sell it because we can sell it. I think executives at Apple are not worried about this at all. They turned around and said, software is up, wearables are up. We've actually grown 0.5% year on year. Smartphone sales are down. Yeah, give a shit. We're going to make all our money in September when we launch a 5G device, completely change the telecommunications market in the throw of it, and we're going to make all of our money in the build up to Christmas with the launch of our new flagship. So long answer there, but Apple have had a drop off in iPhone, but it's nothing to do. I think if you think that that's going to damage the business, you're an idiot.
I won't think that then. Yes, and the drop off in iPhone, actually, we should put it into context because we got the quarterly smartphone numbers come out by various. They've actually started coordinating for the first time in the many years I've been covering this. We've had Strategy Analytics, Omdia, which is for people who don't know, a new name for Ovum, plus the IHS and various other bits and bobs that Informer's got hold of. And IDC as well, all published their numbers on the same day. So that's interesting. You get to do a compare and contrast. And there's also another firm that I wasn't that familiar with called TrendForce, published some numbers. It's Taiwan-based, published some numbers on production. And basically, the long and short of it is in terms of production and in terms of smartphone shipments, they were down 17% year on year in the first quarter. And that's unprecedented. And just to put it into further context, I've been keeping a spreadsheet since Q1 2014 of global smartphone shipments. Q1 2014 global smartphone shipments were 287.8 million, and in this quarter they were 274.8. So we basically had the lowest volume of smartphone shipments globally since before 2014. So that's a pretty massive drop off. And judging by the sort of comments from people like Strategy Analytics, some of it will have been supply, but a lot of it is just demand, discretionary spending on anything. People are spending on groceries, people are spending on stuff like, soap and anything else they think, sort of face mask or whatever else they think is specific to this situation we're in now. But discretionary spending, they just, everyone's quite sensibly just sitting tight and waiting to see how things go. And that's what happens in any crisis. Confidence goes, people just go, right, I'm just not going to spend anything till I know what the hell's going on. So, and in that context, Apple actually didn't do so bad. So their shipments were down 9% year on year, but Samsung's were down 19%, Huawei's were down 18%, and the overall market was down 17%. So actually, Apple outperformed the market. So fair play to them on that one. So that's go on, sorry.
Well, the thing always to remember with Apple is that it just generally doesn't care about this time of year. This is traditionally this and the sort of this 3 months and the next 3 months are very, very quiet periods for Apple. Their sales are very, very weighted towards the Christmas period and around that product launch. Like, it's interesting, every year we go to Mobile World Congress. Well, we didn't go this year, but like most years you go to Mobile World Congress and the first thing you see when you step off the plane is which of the handset manufacturers has won the advertising battle in Barcelona. You know, one year it was the Google Pixel devices, then it's usually Huawei on the Mate X or something like that. Then there's the Samsung Galaxy series, and they've usually plastered all over the place, this advertising. What you never see around sort of February, March time is Apple plastering the walls with their products, because they don't launch anything massive. They don't care about Mobile World Congress. They don't care about, you know, they march to the beats of their own to the beat of their own drum, and they care about all their product sales in the second half of the year. So I think it's interesting they outperformed it. The other thing that is worth bearing in mind is which is makes it very, very difficult for to judge Apple at the moment, is that all of these numbers that you quote are big estimates. Apple has said that its revenues for the iPhone over this period decreased by 6.8%, rather than you were saying that around the 9% mark. Now, Apple doesn't release any figures for its iPhone shipments anymore. It stopped doing that about 2 years ago. So the only thing you can go on is the actual money that can be attributed to the iPhone segment. They don't release any data on how many shipments or the average product price. So 6.8% decline year on year. I don't know. It's very difficult to judge whether it outpaced the market or kept in line with the market, because its products are that much more expensive than everyone else.
Yeah. You mentioned the fact that everyone's having a bit of a guess, and having been one of those people who did the guessing in the past, I'm not going to disagree with you. When I was an analyst, I used to just say that we're paid to be better guessers than everyone else. Obviously, analysts would push back on that, not least my former boss, I'm sure. But you know, so Slash Analytics said 39.2 million by Apple. Omdia said 38.5, and IDC said 36.7. So we've got about a 3 million, well, 2.5 million variation there. So that's though,
isn't it? Oh,
sorry, you what?
I was saying that's 8% variance. So
no, I'm agreeing with you. I think that shows that there's a distinct margin for error in all that stuff. I still think all three of them seem to agree that Apple's year-on-year change was less bad than everyone else's. So I think that's a valid comparison to make. And one point I'll make, Jamie, about Apple's seasonality. Actually, Q1 tends to historically be their second best season. So it's all about Q4. That's by far their blowout season. But then Q1, you get the sort of tail of it, and then it's sort of tapering off until the next Q4. By means of illustration, if we look at last year, Apple was
this summer period, like from fall to January sales is the area they give a shit about. So this summer period is the ones they don't give a shit about. That's traditionally their lower sales. Yeah.
And one other thing I would say about Apple, which is sort of borne out by what you were saying about like diversification and all that sort of thing. Apple is moving towards, it still makes most of its money and its profit from handsets. And that's because it has such a relatively high margin on iPhones compared to the Android ecosystem. But just as important, or at least increasingly as important for Apple, is just the fact that there's an install base, this captive market of all these millions of devices, of people who are compelled to use the App Store, to use Apple apps, to use the whole iOS ecosystem. So that's another way to back up your point, Jamie, about how diversification is helping some companies ride the worst of all this stuff. I think Apple's a great example of that.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a look at the ones that have been successful, the only one that bucks the trends really is Facebook, because their numbers did meet market expectations, and they are the worst company in Silicon Valley for diversification. I mean, I looked at the figures the other day, and something like 98.5% of their revenues is attributable to online advertising. I mean, even if they have tried to spend money on like Portal, which is something you see on TV quite a lot, admittedly because of the COVID, it's a good pivot for marketing during COVID. And also the Oculus, their VR splurge, and also Workplace. They tried entering into, to steal off Slack and Teams and those sorts of companies. They're terrible at it, but their financials have held strong during COVID. Perhaps not as aggressively expanding as they have done in previous quarters, but 18% year-on-year growth is still pretty good for a company the size of Facebook. The others, anyone else who's got a pure play business has been suffering. If you want to relate it back to the telco world, if you actually have a look at the telecommunications companies, which are sort of riding this quite successfully, look at Orange. Orange reported a slight decline year on year for their financials, but it hasn't changed its annual guidance. It's still standing behind these financials for the rest of the year. So this is a company which is incredibly good at convergence. Hold on 2 seconds. The computer wanted to shut down on me. They're incredibly good at convergence, incredibly good at reaching into different and parallel markets. So pure play, anyone who says pure play is you can still do it, I think is going to be struggling over the next couple of years, and this period has shown why. I'm thinking of companies like O2. Up until recently, it said it could be a mobile-only player, and now it's started to forget. It's doing a very, very good impression of Trump, to be perfectly honest. It used to say, I was at a dinner about a year and a half ago, where the CEO of O2 UK, a guy called Mark Evans, turned around and said, convergence is a load of fluff. Don't listen to it. You can be a pure-play mobile player. And then all of a sudden, everyone in the world is looking at convergence, purely because it is a future-proof strategy. There's a lot of these telcos that are around, which I think are going to suffer, but they're small, they're regional telcos, and hopefully they'll learn their lesson and change their ways.
One thing, just to draw a line under the quarterly discussion, a lot of companies, as you just alluded to, and there are a few others we haven't mentioned, like Qualcomm, for example, are not altering their full year guidance. So despite the fact, a lot of them, like Nokia, said Q2 is going to be a bit moody, but it's still not really revising down its full year guidance, if I remember rightly, which says to me that pretty much all companies are thinking, all right, we're riding this out. This quarter's going to suck, just like last quarter did. But Q3, Q4, it's all going to come good. Everything's going to spring back into life. And for example, in the smartphone sector, where we have this unprecedented drop off, there's every reason to believe that what there is just sort of delayed gratification, latent demand, where people still want a smartphone. They're just going to wait one more quarter before buying one. So that's grounds for some optimism.
I think the only difference there is that some businesses are defined by recurring revenue, and some businesses are defined by one-off purchases. So, for instance, smartphones, there might be a bumper second half of the year, like you said, with the pent-up demand. So the smartphone companies aren't really that worried because they have 1 million products, and if you sell 1 million products, it doesn't matter if you sell them over a 12-month period or the second half of that 12-month period, as long as you sell the products. The issue which I see for telcos, for instance, and why they're in perhaps a bit more of a precarious position, is that the ones that were hoping to migrate the majority of, or not majority, but more customers from 4G to 5G contracts, they're, increasing ARPU, but also decreasing the cost of delivering connectivity. That's a recurring revenue model. That's not a one-off purchase. So there's no way you can recover that revenue once you go past this month. If they sign up in April to a 5G contract, you're picking up an extra $10 a month. Let's say, I'm making up these numbers off the top of my head, for the remainder of the year. If they sign up in October, because that's when they got their 5G phone, then all of a sudden you have someone, you're on here twice now, Ian, then you actually have an extra 6 months of revenue, which has been collected because it's a recurring revenue model. So that's the one reason I worry if I was a telco, for instance, about this refreshment upgrade. But it all depends on where you are as a telco. French telcos don't give a shit about this this migration model because, number one, they haven't launched 5G services in their market yet. UK telcos might be a little bit more concerned because they're rapidly scaling their 5G product line or their base stations, so they need to start collecting return on investments. Return on the deployment strategy. It is factored in, month on month, we will grow our 5G. Fucking hell. Can you hear that? Jesus. Month on month, you can you collect more revenues back, and that's factored into the ROI and the CapEx budget that you assign all the way through the year. So the longer, it's not deferred, it's lost revenues. And that could be a worrying position for telcos that have a 5G network that they want to sell contracts on.
That all makes sense, mate. What was that noise?
It's drilling downstairs. The fucking bakers are doing some refurbishment while COVID's on, and it's driving me bananas.
So that you're above a shop and they're completely refitting it, are they?
Yeah, and we got the 2 floors above a bakery, so they're just making an absolute racket.
I hope they're going to chuck you some free bread when they're done.
I bet they don't. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to start walking down the road. If I walk 5 minutes further down the road, I can go to Costa and buy my coffee, and I'm going to buy the coffees there every Saturday morning and walk past the bakery so they can see my coffee, that I've gone out of my way to buy coffees of someone else.
That'll learn them who they think they are. Cool. Well, look, I think we're more or less out of time. Jamie's getting rumblings from beneath. Ian keeps getting cut off and probably needs a top up of Punk IPA or whatever it is he's drinking. So I think we'll wrap it up there. But thanks again, guys, and thank you for listening. And make sure you join us for the next one.